Chapter 62 of Jennie Gerhardt by Theodore DREISER. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The end came after 4 days, during which Jennie was by his bedside almost constantly. The nurse in charge welcomed her at first as a relief and company, but the physician was inclined to object. Lester, however, was stubborn. "This is my death," he said, with a touch of grim humor. "If I am dying, I ought to be allowed to die in my own way." Watson smiled at the man's unfaltering courage. He had never seen anything like it before. There were cards of sympathy, calls of inquiry, notices in the newspaper. Robert saw an item in the Inquirer and decided to go to Chicago. Imogene called with her husband, and they were admitted to Lester's room for a few minutes after Jennie had gone to hers. Lester had little to say. The nurse cautioned them that he was not to be talked to much. When they were gone, Lester said to Jennie, "Imogene has changed a good deal." He made no other comment. Mrs. Kane was on the Atlantic, 3 days out from New York, the afternoon Lester died. He had been meditating whether anything more could be done for Jennie, but he could not make up his mind about it. Certainly it was useless to leave her more money. She did not want it. He had been wondering where Letty was and how near her actual arrival might be when he was seized with a tremendous paroxysm of pain. Before relief could be administered in the shape of an anesthetic, he was dead. It developed afterward that it was not the intestinal trouble which killed him, but a lesion of a major blood vessel in the brain. Jennie, who had been strongly wrought up by watching and worrying, was beside herself with grief. He had been a part of her thought and feeling so long that it seemed now as though a part of herself had died. She had loved him as she had fancied she could never love anyone, and he had always shown that he cared for her, at least in some degree. She could not feel the emotion that expresses itself in tears, only a dull ache, a numbness which seemed to make her insensible to pain. He looked so strong, her Lester, lying there still in death. His expression was unchanged, defiant, determined, albeit peaceful. Word had come from Mrs. Kane that she would arrive on the Wednesday following. It was decided to hold the body. Jennie learned from Mr. Watson that it was to be transferred to Cincinnati, where the Paces had a vault. Because of the arrival of various members of the family, Jennie withdrew to her own home. She could do nothing more. The final ceremonies presented a peculiar commentary on the anomalies of existence. It was arranged with Mrs. Kane by wire that the body should be transferred to Imogene's residence, and the funeral held from there. Robert, who arrived the night Lester died, Barry Dodge, Imogene's husband, Mr. Midgley, and 3 other citizens of prominence were selected as pallbearers. Louise and her husband came from Buffalo, Amy and her husband from Cincinnati. The house was full to overflowing with citizens who either sincerely wished or felt it expedient to call. Because of the fact that Lester and his family were tentatively Catholic, a Catholic priest was called in, and the ritual of that church was carried out. It was curious to see him lying in the parlor of this alien residence, candles at his head and feet, burning sepulchre, a silver cross upon his breast, caressed by his waxen fingers. He would have smiled if he could have seen himself, but the Kane family was too conventional, too set in its convictions, to find anything strange in this. The church made no objection, of course. The family was distinguished. What more could be desired? On Wednesday Mrs. Kane arrived. She was greatly distraught, for her love, like Jennie's, was sincere. She left her room that night when all was silent and leaned over the coffin, studying by the light of the burning candles Lester's beloved features. Tears trickled down her cheek, for she had been happy with him. She caressed his cold cheeks and hands. "Poor dear Lester," she whispered. "Poor brave soul! No one told her that he had sent for Jennie. The Kane family did not know. Meanwhile, in the house on South Park Avenue sat a woman who was enduring alone the pain, the anguish of an irreparable loss. Through all these years the subtle hope had persisted, in spite of every circumstance, that somehow life might bring him back to her. He had come, it is true. He really had in death, but he had gone again. Where? Whither her mother, whither Gerhardt, whither Vesta had gone. She could not hope to see him again, for the papers had informed her of his removal to Mrs. Midgley's residence, and of the fact that he was to be taken from Chicago to Cincinnati for burial. The last ceremonies in Chicago were to be held in one of the wealthy Roman Catholic churches of the South Side, St. Michael's, of which the Midgleys were members. Jennie felt deeply about this. She would have liked so much to have had him buried in Chicago, where she could go to the grave occasionally, but this was not to be. She was never a master of her fate. Others invariably controlled. She thought of him as being taken from her finally by the removal of the body to Cincinnati, as though distance made any difference. She decided at last to veil herself heavily and attend the funeral at the church. The paper had explained that the service would be at 2 in the afternoon. Then at 4 the body would be taken to the depot and transferred to the train. The members of the family would accompany it to Cincinnati. She thought of this as another opportunity. She might go to the depot. A little before the time for the funeral cortege to arrive at the church, there appeared at one of its subsidiary entrances a woman in black, heavily veiled, who took a seat in an inconspicuous corner. She was a little nervous at first, for seeing that the church was dark and empty, she feared lest she had mistaken the time and place. But after 10 minutes of painful suspense, a bell in the church tower began to toll solemnly. Shortly thereafter an acolyte in black gown and white surplice appeared and lighted a group of candles on either side of the altar. A hushed stirring of feet in the choir loft indicated that the service was to be accompanied by music. Some loiterers, attracted by the bell, some idle strangers, a few acquaintances and citizens not directly invited, appeared and took seats. Jennie watched all this with wondering eyes. Never in her life had she been inside a Catholic church. The gloom, the beauty of the windows, the whiteness of the altar, the golden flames of the candles impressed her. She was suffused with a sense of sorrow, loss, beauty, and mystery. Life in all its vagueness and uncertainty seemed typified by this scene. As the bell tolled, there came from the sacristy a procession of altar boys. The smallest, an angelic youth of 11, came first, bearing aloft a magnificent silver cross. In the hands of each subsequent pair of servitors was held a tall, lighted candle. The priest in black cloth and lace, attended by an acolyte on either hand, followed. The procession passed out the entrance into the vestibule of the church, and was not seen again until the choir began a mournful, responsive chant, the Latin supplication for mercy and peace. Then at this sound the solemn procession made its reappearance. There came the silver cross, the candles, the dark-faced priest reading dramatically to himself as he walked, and the body of Lester in a great black coffin with silver handles, carried by the pallbearers, who kept an even pace. Jennie stiffened perceptibly, her nerves responding as though to a shock from an electric current. She did not know any of these men. She did not know Robert. She had never seen Mr. Midgley. Of the long company of notables who followed 2 by 2, she recognized only 3, whom Lester had pointed out to her in past times. Mrs. Kane she saw, of course, for she was directly behind the coffin, leaning on the arm of a stranger. Behind her walked Mr. Watson, solemn, gracious. He gave a quick glance to either side, evidently expecting to see her somewhere, but not finding her. He turned his eyes gravely forward and walked on. Jennie looked with all her eyes, her heart gripped by pain. She seemed so much a part of this solemn ritual, yet infinitely removed from it all. The procession reached the altar rail, and the coffin was put down. A white shroud bearing the insignia of suffering, a black cross, was put over it, and the great candles were set beside it. There were chanted invocations and responses, the sprinkling of the coffin with holy water, the lighting and swinging of the censer, and then the mumbled responses of the auditors to the Lord's Prayer and to its Catholic edition, the Invocation to the Blessed Virgin. Jennie was overawed and amazed, but no show of form colorful, impression imperial, could take away the sting of death, the sense of infinite loss. To Jennie the candles, the incense, the holy song were beautiful. They touched a deep chord of melancholy in her and made it vibrate through the depths of her being. She was as a house filled with mournful melody and the presence of death. She cried and cried. She could see, curiously, that Mrs. Kane was sobbing convulsively also. When it was all over, the carriages were entered and the body was borne to the station. All the guests and strangers departed, and finally, when all was silent, she arose. Now she would go to the depot also, for she was hopeful of seeing his body put on the train. They would have to bring it out on the platform, just as they did in Vesta's case. She took a car, and a little later she entered the waiting room of the depot. She lingered about, first in the concourse, where the great iron fence separated the passengers from the tracks, and then in the waiting room, hoping to discover the order of proceedings. She finally observed the group of immediate relatives waiting: Mrs. Kane, Robert, Mrs. Midgley, Louise, Amy, Imogene, and the others. She actually succeeded in identifying most of them, though it was not knowledge in this case, but pure instinct and intuition. No one had noticed in the stress of excitement, but it was Thanksgiving Eve. Throughout the great railroad station there was a hum of anticipation, that curious ebullition of fancy which springs from the thought of pleasure to come. People were going away for the holiday. Carriages were at the station entries. Announcers were calling in stentorian voices the destination of each new train as the time of its departure drew near. Jennie heard with a desperate ache the description of a route which she and Lester had taken more than once, slowly and melodiously emphasized: Detroit, Toledo, Cleveland, Buffalo, and New York. There were cries for trains for Fort Wayne, Columbus, Pittsburgh, Philadelphia, and points east, and then finally for Indianapolis, Louisville, Columbus, Cincinnati, and points south. The hour had struck. Several times Jennie had gone to the concourse between the waiting room and the track to see if through the iron grating which separated her from her beloved she could get one last look at the coffin or the great wooden box which held it before it was put on the train. Now she saw it coming. There was a baggage porter pushing a truck into position near the place where the baggage car would stop. On it was Lester, the last shadow of his substance, encased in the honors of wood and cloth and silver. There was no thought on the part of the porter of the agony of loss which was represented here. He could not see how wealth and position in this hour were typified to her mind as a great fence, a wall, which divided her eternally from her beloved. Had it not always been so? Was not her life a patchwork of conditions made and affected by these things which she saw, wealth and force which had found her unfit? She had evidently been born to yield, not seek. This panoply of power had been paraded before her since childhood. What could she do now but stare vaguely after it as it marched triumphantly by? Lester had been of it. Him it respected. Of her it knew nothing. She looked through the grating, and once more there came the cry of Indianapolis, Louisville, Columbus, Cincinnati, and points south. A long red train, brilliantly lighted, composed of baggage cars, day coaches, a dining car set with white linen and silver, and a half a dozen comfortable Pullmans, rolled in and stopped. A great black engine, puffing and glowing, had it all safely in tow. As the baggage car drew near the waiting truck, a train hand in blue, looking out of the car, called to someone within. "Hey, Jack, give us a hand here. There's a stiff outside." Jennie could not hear. All she could see was the great box that was so soon to disappear. All she could feel was that this train would start presently, and then it would all be over. The gates opened. The passengers poured out. There were Robert and Amy and Louise and Midgely, all making for the Pullman cars in the rear. They had said their farewells to their friend. No need to repeat them. A trio of assistants gave a hand at getting the great wooden case into the car. Jennie saw it disappear with an acute physical wrench at her heart. There were many trunks to be put aboard, and then the door of the baggage car half closed. But not before the warning bell of the engine sounded. There was the insistent calling of "All aboard!" from this quarter and that. Then slowly the great locomotive began to move. Its bell was ringing, its steam hissing, its smokestack throwing aloft a great black plume of smoke that fell back over the cars like a pall. The fireman, conscious of the heavy load behind, flung open a flaming furnace door to throw in coal. Its light glowed like a golden eye. Jennie stood rigid, staring into the wonder of this picture, her face white, her eyes wide, her hands unconsciously clasped. But one thought in her mind: they were taking his body away. A leaden November sky was ahead, almost dark. She looked and looked until the last glimmer of the red lamp on the receding sleeper disappeared in the maze of smoke and haze overhanging the tracks of the far-stretching yard. "Yes," said the voice of a passing stranger, gay with the anticipation of coming pleasures. "We're going to have a great time down there. Remember Annie? Uncle Jim is coming, and Aunt Ella." Jennie did not hear that or anything else of the chatter and bustle around her. Before her was stretching a vista of lonely years, down which she was steadily gazing. Now what? She was not so old yet. There were those two orphan children to raise. They would marry and leave after a while, and then what? Days and days in endless reiteration, and then... End of chapter 62. Recording by Richard Kilmer, Rio Medina, Texas. End of Jennie Gerhardt by Theodore DREISER.